It is my job to say things used to be better, but I really think they used to be better. We didn't always have an internet made out of 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4.
Most people have no idea at all that alternatives exist. That lack of awareness of how complex and how powerful the tools that we use are every day, that ripples up into a lot of our kind of political and social relationships as well.
It just seems like the service is getting worse. Like there are these ads, and then there's this stuff you didn't ask for, and some of the people you're following, they don't show up, and you go and you try and toggle the settings, and you switch them around, you try to find something that works for you, and then in the background, Facebook can just change the setting.
Hi, I'm James Bridle. I wrote a book called New Dark Age that first came out about 5 years ago and is now re-released into a world that hasn't changed that much. It's a book about the way in which computation has come to dominate everyday life, and a small number of people and companies have come to dominate computation, and all of us are kind of living within their imaginations, and that has deep effects on pretty much every aspect of our daily lives and on the planet that we live in. And I'm interested in the ways in which we can understand the history of how that came to be, what it feels like to live within it now, and how we can be honest about the situation that we're in, so that we can start to think about the changes that we might make to imagine a different world.
And I'm Cory Doctorow. Mostly I write science fiction novels, but I've spent more than 2 decades working with various nonprofits, primarily the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the UK Open Rights Group, on issues related to tech policy and digital human rights. And after 20 years, I'm old. I'm over 50. I have 2 artificial hips. As soon as I can stop touring with new books, I'm getting both my eyes fixed because I got cataracts. So it is my job to say things used to be better, but I really think they used to be better. I really think that we didn't always have an internet made out of 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And I don't think that happened because, the great forces of history bore down on the moment to enshittify the web. I think that we created that circumstance through specific policies, and that there are policies that can get us out of it. So I've written this book called The Internet Con: How to Seize the Means of Computation. That's about how the tech companies ended up dominating so much of our digital lives, and how we can do something about it that goes beyond what we're currently doing, which is primarily focused on making the tech companies better. Like, we've elected them kings for life, and now we just want them to be wise kings. And I really want to overthrow them. I want to abolish big tech. And to do that, we need policies that are administratable, that like regulators can administer, that don't require like 10 years to figure out if they're violating them. And we need policies that don't create what are called compliance moats. That's where like it costs so much to be a tech company that only big tech can be a tech company, which means that we have to keep them around for the rest of the time. And so the Internet Con, it's a long form argument about what tech fears the most, which is things that bust open their silos, and how we can get it and how we can keep it.
I've been really struck, particularly just in the last couple of years, by one of the effects that you mentioned there, which is how the tech companies, basically the only people capable of doing the kind of tech that we assume to be tech right now. So like the current version of AI that we have is that this mass data thing. Like there's been no huge revolution in how we imagine what AI might be in decades. But what there has been is this like huge accumulation of data, these vast buildings of kind of processing power plants that have allowed a few tech companies to build this particular technology that they're selling to us as AI. And it's a huge hype market, but only they could do it because only they have like the power, the money, and the data to do it. So they've constructed this world that's kind of their imagination of computation.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I just want to say, like, because the subtitle of your new book is Seizing the Means of Computation. And in mine, I kind of look quite a lot about like how that idea of what computation is has become so powerful. I wonder why you use the word computation rather than like technology or something like because it is kind of the technical term a little bit.
Because Marx called on us to seize the means of production, and seize the means of computation sounds like seize the means of production in a way that seize the means of technology doesn't. It's just a better phrase. You needn't read too deeply into it. But I think that, this this thing that you're describing, right? This anxiety about AI is well placed, and I also fear that it is another opportunity for us to do the same thing that we've always done, only harder, and hope for a different outcome. So, a lot of arts groups, I think, are very rightly worried that these, and I hate calling them AI. They're not artificial, they're not intelligent, they're not learning, so they're not machine learning. I don't know if you can expand the acronym off the cuff, but there's this acronym SALAMI that this Italian member of parliament came up with. It's like self-actualizing machine something something. Anyway, the point is that
I think
when
we
you
can call it hype
gen-
AI. You know.
yeah, I think like salami generated image has the correct degree of gravitas as compared to like AI generated image. So I think that there's a reasonable concern that the reason that firms that currently employ creative laborers are so excited about AI is not because they want to make funny memes, right? It's because they want to zero out their wage bill. And they are really like, that's the entire, whenever you hear someone from Goldman Sachs go off and say this is $1 trillion market, what they mean is $1 trillion can be shifted from labor to capital. uh, they're probably lying, right? I think they're overestimating. They always add several zeros just to justify their salaries, but that's what people are hoping for. And my concern is that if we take that seriously, which I think we should, and then approach it with an unserious solution, which is to say, we're going to create a new exclusive right to think really hard about art, right? To go and measure all the noses and come up with a statistical picture of all the possible noses that are recognizable as a nose. And we're going to create that right. We're going to give it to creative workers. And then we're going to hope that those creative workers can bargain with that right to make sure that they keep their jobs, that we're going to be very disappointed. And we know that's the case because there are a bunch of people who work in voice acting who are rightfully worried that their employers would like to put them out of a job, who have argued vociferously for this new right to basically think really hard about their voice, and who are now going into recording sessions with the games companies that constitute the largest plurality of voice actor work. And every session is required to begin with a phrase to the effect of, "My name is Cory Doctorow, and I hereby assign in perpetuity, freely and of my own will, the right to train a machine learning system with the recording from this session." Right? And that has just become the boilerplate for these large concentrated firms. So my concern is that if we just create this right and we give it to people who have no bargaining power, and we say, go and bargain with it, that they'll just bargain it away, that it's just a roundabout way of telling companies, here, go make some AI, right? Only the companies that can command enough of the labor of creative workers can do it. But once they have, then no one has to hire a creative worker again. And I think that is the trap that we keep getting ourselves into, that we keep giving large firms, whether they're tech firms or entertainment firms, the policies that are supposed to control them, and end up enshrining them, whether that's telling Facebook that they have to police all of their content for harassment, which requires that you need an army of moderators, which requires that you be the size of Facebook, or whether it's this new thing that we're about to do with salami, where we say, you have the right to control who can make salami out of your stuff. And then all the people who you rely on for your pay packet say, great, give us that right now.
Right. So there's no bargaining with the setup that we have at the present, which is why you argue for the dismantling of these companies rather than essentially to kind of bargain with them. It's not entirely a dismantling, right? It's also the construction of alternative structures. There has to be like something that we move across to. There's a phrase I saw in one of your recent pieces, which is like the right to exit.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me really hard that that's a real extension of something that we do poorly in the real world, but I've always recognized as kind of really incredibly important. I think a really formative experience I had like a few decades ago was actually was going to Cuba, which is a place that I thought I would enjoy more than I did, essentially, like aesthetically, politically, everything. And the thing that really horrified me uh, about about going there was that most people couldn't leave. Um, and that I had this realization that stuck with me ever since and informs almost all of my politics, that the freedom of movement is the first freedom. Like, it's above freedom of speech. It's above all other things, because if you can
Sure.
just get away, then you have these other possibilities. But you're kind of, the way you describe this kind of enshittification process, is a big part of that is like stopping movement, right? It's like it's preventing anyone getting out in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, so we've had monopolies before. They're not novel. They're not novel in arts markets. They're not novel in infrastructure. They're not novel in manufacturing and heavy goods, right? Whether that's rail companies or energy companies or even the entertainment industry before the digital world, right? Back when the Beatles used to have to share 1 penny for every LP they sold, but not the whole penny, because EMI kept 15% of the penny against their marketing expenses, right? We've had abusive firms that had lots of market power before, but the digital world has got a couple of really important tools at its disposal, one being technical and the other one being policy. So the technical tool is that digital firms can alter the shape of the physics of the system from moment to moment, right? So say you join Facebook because it makes this implicit promise when you join that if you merely tell Facebook who the people are that matter to you, it will order all of the things that those people have said in a feed and let you know about them. And moreover, they'll make this promise, as they did when they first opened up to the wider public, that they'll never spy on you. That was Facebook's old pitch, right? Don't use MySpace. The crapulent Australian billionaire owns MySpace. He spies on you all the time to sell ads. We'll never spy on you. We're Facebook. We're the good guys. And you join up, and then like it just seems like the service is getting worse. Like there are these ads, and then there's this stuff you didn't ask for, and some of the people you're following, they don't show up, and you go and you try and toggle the settings, and you switch them around, you try to find something that works for you, and then in the background Facebook can just change the settings, right? They I call it twiddling. They have like a million knobs, and they can just touch their knobs all day long and twiddle them until all the rules have changed. This is why, like, people who work for the platforms, right, the people whose job is whose boss is an algorithm, right, like go spend thousands of pounds and hundreds of hours making a video, and maybe we'll show it to your followers. Those people all act like rats who spend too much time in a intermittent reinforcement Skinner box, right? They're just completely mad because everything that works today stops working tomorrow. Like YouTube is like, well, today if your icon for your video has got a lot of primary colors in it, we're going to show it to everyone. But tomorrow it's going to have like at least 40% gray, or we're not going to show it to people. And these people are just like trapped in this endless kind of game. And so you've got the platforms twiddling all day long, and that makes it very hard for people to seize the means of computation, to control their technological experience. And then you've got a policy prohibition against twiddling back, right? Reverse engineering, at using bots and scraping to grab your data and bring it to some other service so that you can quit Facebook, go to a service where they don't spy on you, read all the messages that are waiting for you on Facebook because a bot went and got them, reply to them, and the bot will go and send them to them, and you never have to do anything where Mark Zuckerberg can see it again. That has become illegal. It wasn't illegal when Facebook started. That was how Facebook started. They gave you a tool that would go get your MySpace messages and put them in your Facebook inbox. Now it's illegal. And so we can't twiddle back. So you have firms that are not constrained by regulation, not constrained by competition, who can twiddle with every hour that God sends, and we can't twiddle back. We can't create a new service. Like, anyone can create a new service, but you can't create a new service that talks to the existing ones, so that anyone who leaves Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or any of these other big platforms has to say goodbye to everything that's there. Otherwise, because none of that stuff is accessible from that new platform, not for technical reasons, but because as a policy matter, we prohibit it. And that means that people are locked in. They can't leave. They can't leave for the same reason. My grandmother left the Soviet Union after the war. She and my grandfather deserted from the Red Army. They destroyed their papers so they could be displaced people. They made their way from Azerbaijan to Poland to Frankfurt to Canada. But none of their family did, right? They all stayed. My grandmother lost touch with her mother and her little brother for 15 years. My dad tells us, like, hair stands up in the back of your neck story about being in Toronto and the phone ringing and my grandmother just going, "Mama, mama," because she didn't know if her mother was alive or dead. The reason her family stayed in Leningrad was because to leave meant giving up everything, right? Which is what my grandmother did, right? And so all of them held each other hostage. And so what we need to do is lower the transaction costs, lower the switching costs, so that people aren't imprisoned in situations they don't like by the people they love, so that people can go somewhere else and do the things that they love, and so that the firms themselves become disciplined, so that they're not secure in the knowledge that if they treat you badly, you won't go, because if you leave, it's not that you have nowhere else to go, but if you leave, you'll have to give up everything.
Are the experiences of people on more social media, by which I mean people chatting to their friends allegedly on Twitter and Facebook and so on, comparable? Like, are they the same as the experiences of people who are content creators, who are deliberately monetizing their experiences? Because it does strike me that those are two different ways of being online. And one of the things it feels that the big tech companies have done over the years is convince us that we are kind of all content creators to some
Mm-hmm.
extent. And certainly, if we're professionals in any way, there's a part of our being social is selling ourselves, and there's not much
Mm-hmm.
differentiation between those kind of things. But I don't know, I'm not sure how. And I'm fully up, and I would really like to start discussing more like the alternatives. But like, if there is really an alternative, if your work, which for content creators, and I think we know what I mean by that, is to make money, is there really like an alternative system of doing that that isn't so crushing, or is there like or do we have to maybe look at the social experience as something a little bit different from that? Because we're talking about loved
so,
ones,
so
and we're talking about audiences
yeah,
in a blurred way, I feel.
so let me reframe that very slightly, because I think that there is a sense that what we lack is designs for alternatives, right? That like we're trapped in this like kind of hegemonic view of engagement and Facebook and whatever, and then we don't we are our imagination for a different way of being online, whether it's with our friends or as people who perceive ourselves as having an audience, right? Having a networked public, as the sociologists say. That is the thing that we're trapped in. I actually don't think that's true. I mean, there are so many visions of what social media could be, whether that is something that is oriented around a purely sociable experience, or an experience where you perceive yourself as being in an audience, or being a part of a community of creators, or some mix of both. And the internet is full of them. In fact, every time I talk about this stuff, I get a dozen emails from people who are like, I would like to give you a tour of my platform that I have built that has a completely different sort of physics of interaction. And many of them look like places that I would happily settle into. The problem with these isn't that they don't exist and that we can't imagine them. Problem is that we can't leave where we're at to get to them. And so I mean, I hear what you're saying, uh, in that, there is something very sweaty and awful about the way that creators have to conceive of themselves and comport themselves on these platforms, that is untenable. And you see this with burnout, and even the ones that are the most lovable and kind and glorious ones. I'm thinking of, like, say, Hank Green or something. They're quite candid about how hard it is on them, and the pressures that they face, and we've all seen flameouts of these people. And what I want to say is that, like, there's not one way of being a creator and making your living from creative labor. There are lots and lots of ways. And so there are lots and lots of different arrangements of the physics of interaction that will suit those different creators. That what we've done by collapsing, again, and I want to stress, like, by policy, not by technology, collapsing all the possibilities down to one, or one model, or one model with minor variations, right? You can have, this is like that scene in the Blues Brothers. We got both kinds, country and Western, right? We've got YouTube and TikTok. uh, is that everyone either has to be that creator or has to shoehorn themselves into it. I think that there are spaces that people want to be in where the physics of interaction do not require, or uh, even permit, that kind of performer and audience situation, and there are other people whose proclivities and priorities are different, and that they'll change from moment to moment, and that there is no one right answer, and that there is no enduring answer, and that the problem isn't uh, the one model, right? We have that model is fine for some people. There are some people for whom it works very well. The problem is that it's the only model, and that um, the policies that prevent us from building interoperable tools, that building ways to leave without paying that high cost, that prevents the immersion, the emergence of those other models.
Yeah, so I mean, this idea of there only being one model is super powerful to me. I've spent quite a lot of time looking at, and it's the reason I brought up computation right at the origin of this, is because I spent a lot of time thinking about alternative models for computation itself.
Yeah.
Um, and not because, well, and to explain that a little bit more, so looking back, for example, at Turing's early papers, where he both outlines the what's come to be known as the universal Turing machine, this thing that we all use and this defines everything, including, I feel, kind of the way that we think about the world. Um, uh, but he also describes these kind of alternatives that were never really explored beyond very limited kind of theoretical ideas, that proposes that all the computation we have could look something entirely radically different. And my reason for exploring those things, which leads to all kinds of fascinating ideas, is not that I think we're about to suddenly build computers made out of crabs or computers made out of pipes and the kind of half waterfall, half calculator. Although we could do those things and those things exist and they're marvelous, I think it's important just to always remember and to continually assert that radical alternatives are possible, have been imagined. And I feel that while a huge amount of the work to make this exit, this transfer possible is really important, I also feel that most people have no idea at all that alternatives exist. And I also think that just telling them that alternatives exist is woefully insufficient. Because actually, if people get excited and interested about the possibility of alternatives and change, they're capable of bearing quite a lot of cost in that. They're capable of experimenting it in ways that may lead them to lose something but gain something else. And the bit I'm quite interested in is like, what is it that, and I think this is a much bigger question than just like how you get people to switch technologies, or though these are important questions, and then much bigger questions about our relationship to governance, to politics, to climate change, a whole bunch of other stuff. What is it that you need to give to people in order to allow them to think, imagine, and make those alternatives happen for themselves? Because for me, I think it's very much not like information about this possibility. It's not just telling them that there's something wrong or that there's some kind of alternative available. It's actually giving them certain tools and training in them that they can actually kind of deploy. Um, and so for me, for a long time, that was teaching people like simple bits of code. But it was also it's things like crypto parties where people learn to install ad blockers or use basic encryption. And the point of those things is in part to like protect people. Like at the end of it, they'll come out like with better passwords or like having an understanding of encryption. But it's also to kind of increase their confidence and their agency within these complex systems that most people are so like brutalized by that they can't really imagine any kind of change. So
Hmm.
as well as the kind of like big governance level law changes that can be and absolutely should be done, and we can talk about those. Like, where do you see? It's really difficult because I don't want to put this all onto individual action, which is really not my intention at all, which is also where this often gets stuck. It's like, well, if only individuals would act like this, we'd be able to kind of move forward. But at the same time, there's some kind of lesson or learning or skills that are required to imagine these alternatives. And I feel like a lot of your books talk about that,
Mhm.
particularly in your fiction, particularly in the young adult stuff, perhaps, or in books like Walk Away. Like you're talking about like what are the skills necessary just to get us up to the level of kind of making those changing? Um, yeah, what do you have any thoughts on
Hmm.
that?
So, you're right. I love the idea that science fiction can help us imagine other worlds. I often say that, science fiction is like the opposite of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism's, canonical statement from Thatcher is there is no alternative, right? Which is demand disguised as an observation, right? There is no alternative as a way of saying stop trying to imagine an alternative,
Yeah,
right?
and
This is
that's
this is all we got.
that's the position we're in with those big tech companies. There is no
Yeah,
alternative to their particular offering in the present moment.
yeah. Yeah, and so there are people who feel that way, even people who are critics of the firms. The critic Lee Vinsel has got a very useful term, critahype, which is basically like when you take a firm's claims at face value and then use them to criticize it. So, canonically, the big one would be saying, look at Facebook, they built a mind control array. We know because Cambridge Analytica told their customers that. Isn't it terrible that these people have a mind control array? And it's possible for them to be terrible and also not have a mind control array. It's possible that the reason that, your uncle became a QAnon Brexiter is because he was always a QAnon Brexiter racist, and that what maybe they made it easier to do was for him to find other people, and also maybe at the same time we let our institutions decay so that all of that stuff sounded more plausible than it had earlier in his life. But my experience of technology users. Well, let me step back a step. I think one of the most odious and telling phrases in technological discussion, and I'm not saying that you said it, I know you this is nothing you would ever come into your mouth, is this technology is so easy your mom could use it. And the reason it's so odious is not merely because it's sexist, but because of the embedded sexism in technological development, which means that no one is, inviting the person we think of when we say your mom into the room when we design the technology, right? Like famously, the first technology ever developed for moms was this Honeywell kitchen computer that cost, $100,000, took up your entire kitchen and allowed you to retrieve recipes with punch cards. It was designed by like six blokes, and they never sold one because no one wanted that computer, right? And and just to step back one thing, I loved your description of Turing machines, and it reminded me that Alan Turing invented the Turing machine and the non-Turing machine, which I think is great. And von Neumann invented the von Neumann machine and the non-von Neumann machine, which is just terrific. Someday I want to invent the Doctoral machine and the non-Doctoral machine. But the your mom, to the extent that she makes computer, or anyone who is not included in the design briefing and in the equities of the technology, to the extent that they use technologies, it's because they work so much harder than people like me who are front and center in the technological design thinking of anyone designing a technology. And my experience of people at the margins is that they are much better at using technology than I am, right? So the first person I ever met who had a phone that could accommodate two SIMs and that had a mod in it that allowed you to say, this SIM is from a carrier that gives me free unlimited texting, and this SIM is from a carrier that gives me free unlimited voice calls, automatically switch among them, were the minimum wage nursery ladies at my daughter's nursery in Hackney, right? And the reason for that is because no one had built a phone that took account of their equities, right? The phones are all designed around the assumption that you are not price sensitive to this stuff. That it just you just bait a hook, free texting, and then they'll make it up on the gouging on calling. GB WhatsApp is this alternative WhatsApp client. It was developed on the battlefields of Syria by free software hackers. It's currently maintained primarily in West Africa. It is the most popular version of WhatsApp there. It's more popular than Facebook Messenger. It has a bunch of built-in tools that are locally contextual. It supports multiple SIMs. It has some extra privacy features, whatever. And like, no one's marketing it there, right? It's just spreading because there is like an indigenous need for a technology that has contours and affordances that are not present in the main technology. I'm not saying that we should be callous about the needs of marginal people or assume that everyone's going to get it. And absolutely, having helped run some crypto parties, I know that knowledge is incomplete, right? People might be very skilled at understanding their immediate needs about having two SIMs and less skilled about understanding the surveillance risks of the operating system mod they installed. In fact, many GB WhatsApp versions that you install come with a bunch of surveillanceware in them because there isn't a central repository, and people don't understand those risks because they require a degree of technical sophistication. But I'm not, which is by way of saying that where I want the regulation and where I want the controls is in making sure that if you do take a flutter on something and just switch to something else that seems new that your friends are using, that seems like it suits you better, that it doesn't destroy your life with, technological poison, right? That's a thing I think we need to be very focused on. But I'm less worried about people who are ill served by the current technology discovering those alternatives, because I think they know about them, and I think that they're motivated to find them in a way that people who are complacent aren't. I mean, that's why pornographers are the first to use technology. It's not because being in the sex trade makes you technologically savvy. It's because they keep getting chased off of all the other platforms. So they're always looking for something new, just like kids, just like terrorists. Anyone who's not welcome is always looking for something new.
Yeah, I mean, my position on the kind of big regulation is much like yours. It's like we live in a I think without taking the words out of your mouth, is that we live in in communities at national scales where we have a responsibility to protect one another, and that you should be able to drink the water or other things. My the one I always come back to is I did a lot of work looking at the kind of really horrific stuff that appears on YouTube, and the way it has traumatized and done incredible damage to children. Like straight up, there's no question. Like horrible things have been done to the minds of small children because of content that YouTube has allowed to exist because it makes them money. YouTube's argument is that it's impossible to moderate that. And it's at scale, and anyway, technology moves too fast for regulation and blah, blah, blah. They never talk about the fact that YouTube and Facebook are the single biggest political donors in Washington, D.C. these days, and they have lawmakers in their pockets and so on and so forth. They just talk about the fact it's actually impossible to regulate this stuff. And of course, it's not impossible to regulate it. The example that I use is you've lived in the UK. You know what Boots is. Boots is a high street pharmacist drugstore that is on every single high street and is just like part of the fabric of everyday life. People get their medicines there, they get their sandwiches there, whatever. You don't think about it very much. But if every fifth person who went into Boots came out believing in the superiority of the white race, you'd shut it down. Like it's just not you would just deal with it in a way that we don't deal with technology at all, and I think that's like really quite fundamental. But the other thing that I was thinking when you're speaking about this, like we made it so easy that X could use it. What I hear in that statement is like we made it so easy so that you don't have to think about it. That we removed all of the friction from this situation, so that there's no critique kind of enters at any point. And that does this massive disservice because it erases like everything that's going on there. The classic example being like delivery services, DoorDash, Uber Eats, whatever it is. We made it so easy to order food that you don't see the dark kitchens, you don't see the breakdown in labor relations, you don't see all of that happening. So a lot gets erased when things get easy, but also like we lose the opportunity to be educated by the tools that we use. The lack of friction means that there's no possibility of learning from the things that we use every day, which are these incredibly powerful tools that we could be in charge of in more powerful ways. But that agency is like deliberately stripped away by the things that we use every day. And that like disempowerment, that lack of awareness of how complex and how powerful the tools that we use are every day, like I think that ripples up into a lot of our kind of political and social relationships as well. And that I think one of the values of a lot of the kind of alternative technologies that we could talk about, whether that's something like Mastodon or the other WhatsApp client you use, like anyone who engages with those things, one of the reasons that some people, maybe a lot of people don't, is they're a little bit harder to use. You have to put in that like little bit of extra effort to use them. but that little bit of effort has this incredible reward, right? Not just in the thing that you're using, but in this like increased ability to use all kinds of things like it, to like understand a little bit more about the system that you're actually engaged with. That is itself kind of empowering in this way. And for me, that's really a huge part of what's lost when the tools, the big media systems that we're engaged with all the time strip away so much of like the reality of what we're doing, because all other forms of education have basically been blasted out the way, right? So we kind of have to build that education into the tools that we use, um, so that so that we're capable of using those tools for the actual empowerment that they present.
Yeah, yeah. You really hit on something there. I think when you started talking about this, I kind of had a knee jerk reaction, which was, well, there's no virtue in things being hard to use. And when I think of something being hard to use, I mean obscure Emacs syntax, or badly written documentation, or an app that crashes, and so you have to, with no autosave, so you have to save your work. Like I use the GIMP to edit all my images, and it has no autosave function. If you don't save, you just lose it, right? And it crashes from time. And I'm like, there's no virtue in that. But then you started talking about DoorDash and the other delivery services, and this reminded me of the sleight of hand that the tech sector does, which is a kind of inevitabilism of its own, which says that if you want to have a service free from harassment, it has to be the scale of Facebook. If you want to have a tool that people who don't have a lot of technical expertise can use to form communities to discuss their rare diseases or their parenting struggles or their immigration woes or whatever it is they're going to do, you have to also accept surveillance and monopoly and all these other things. And another one is, if you want a graphic editing program that doesn't crash and is easy to use, then I suppose you won't mind it being easy to use a delivery service that requires that some poor bloke be shitting in a bag because he's not allowed to take a toilet break while he delivers your pizza, right? And for me, the miracle of interoperability, of being able to plug an ad blocker in, or use an alternative client to access a service. Like there's a program called OG app. It doesn't exist anymore because the app stores put it out of business. And what OG app did was it asked you to log into Instagram by throwing up a web browser. And then when Instagram gave back what's called the session key, which is like how it knows that you're successfully logged in, it dropped it into its app. And then it went to Instagram and it pulled all the messages waiting for you at Instagram, threw away everything that was like a fake TikTok video, threw away all the ads, threw away all the algorithmic suggestions. What was left was a kind of refined ore of just the things that the people you liked had to say, put them in reverse chronological order and just show them to you. And then, unlike the Instagram app, which every time you scroll, you tap or do anything, it's sending that information back to Facebook, your battery level, your location, everything. It just gave no data unless you liked something. And then it gave them the data that you liked it. Or if you commented on something, it sent it the comment, but nothing that you didn't intentionally send. So for me, this is a way of prizing apart this inevitabilist, unitary version, right? This pre-Reformation version of the Instagram faith, and bringing in a kind of Protestant Reformation where you can reconfigure your relationship to these tools and the people that they bring you to, whether it's social media or a way to experience a connection with a creative laborer, or a way to organize groups to do group projects, be they running a family holiday or running a workers cooperative, a way for you to reconfigure them around your needs by drawing on a variety of vendors and individuals and tinkerers whose conduct's outer boundaries are set by democratically accountable regulation. So what they can do with your private information and how they can act in respect of you, so that you know that you're not going to get poisoned, and that you can get what you want. Now, one of the problems with this is that it's going to also produce people who are like, I would like to reconfigure my social media to make me as much of a white nationalist as possible, right? That is one of the problems. And it is the problem of having any space in which people are allowed to conduct a social round without the uh, supervision and control of the state, is that people will do odious things in those places. And the degree to which we impinge on that is something that we have contested, I mean, really forever. The Fourth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution goes back to these uh, general warrants, right? Which was a warrant for any officer of the law to enter any premises and search anything without any particularized suspicion, right? That is like, this is a centuries old fight that we may not be able to resolve in this digital realm, but at the very least, like, that would be a better fight to be having than whether Mark Zuckerberg should be allowed to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, uh, I had a thought about that. Oh yeah, so one of the examples that I use so you've given a really good example there of how like building a different piece of software to access a an existing service, like an alternative uh, client essentially to
Content.
existing
Yeah.
service, allows for like this very different relationship with that service. An example that I often give of kind of the ways in which alternatives to kind of big centralized systems like shift things is in video clients, in the difference between though this applies to a lot of social media, essentially between centralized and decentralized services, or like server-based versus peer-to-peer systems. And I'm often doing this, as so many of us done for the last few years, like on Zoom, because somehow, despite all the opportunities of COVID, like breaking apart everything, we've ended up with, like, it seems, even bigger monopolies. Amongst other bad things at the end than we did at the beginning. And so I talk all the time on Zoom to people about like decentralizing the internet, but I explained to them, like, what we're doing right now is we are talking through um, a someone else's server, like one central thing that sits at the center of the network, and by talking through it, we are making it more powerful. Like, we are
Mm-hmm.
contributing to it by doing this. And they said there are alternative versions to this, that there are peer-to-peer video services that connect through all these kind of weird trickly networks. We connect directly to each other through a bunch of kind of weird side roads that avoid that kind of total centralization. And what's really powerful about this, and what I think people do get when I explain this, is that by doing that, you're not just taking power away from that big central thing, you're actually strengthening an entirely different kind of network. That you are like shifting, you're changing the topography of the network, right? Because actually that network is formed constantly by the interactions that we have with it. The network is reshaped by the actions that we take. And that for me is like something that I think people do get quite a lot when you're trying to explain to them about like why these systems matter, is that because it's actually one of those things that kind of bridges the gap between like individual action and collective action. People see that like taking an
Mm-hmm.
individual action does
Mm-hmm.
do this kind of much bigger thing, and that maybe it is worth kind of doing that kind of little weird thing that they need to do, that that may be a little bit complicated, but like makes a change.
So this is where I want to distinguish between like seizing someone else's computation and just building your own, because I think I quite like the idea of seizing other people's computation, right? So like, we have this incredibly centralized service, Amazon, that has done a whole bunch of things. Among them is they've assigned a unique identifier to effectively every product in the stream of commerce, right? The ASIN number, which started off as a variant on the ISBN because they used to just sell books, and now it's this metastatic alphanumeric code that describes everything. So imagine if you could integrate into all of the major point of sale and inventory software something that could translate between everything that you as a merchant had, whether you were someone like Argos or just the local corner shop, had on the shelves, and the Amazon ASINs. And then me, as someone who lives in the neighborhood, could install a plugin that when I search for something on Amazon, uh, if anyone in the neighborhood had that thing, it replaced the buy it with Amazon to buy it from the corner shop button, right? So this is basically turning Amazon into a dumb pipe, right? And just using it as infrastructure. And, Amazon might try and renumber all of its ASINs. That's going to be a hell of a project for them because they've got all these, that, part of Amazon's strength is getting all these other sellers to use those ASINs. So they're pretty locked into those ASINs. Their counter moves are pretty limited there. Really, the thing that stands in the way is, claims about tortious interference with contract and misappropriation of IP and a bunch of other nonsense, right? It's not a technical matter. The technical matter is pretty easy. In fact, because we have so much monopolization and concentration in point of sale software, you'd really only have to integrate it with like 2 or 3 pieces of software and you get nearly every merchant because they're also locked into these things. And then we do it again to the point of sale software, right? Or Uber, right? Everyone's got the Uber client because all the drivers have the Uber client, the driver side thing, and it sucks and they're super predatory and they're awful. So, but if you land in a new city and you want to get a cab, you're pretty stuck, right? It's going to be very hard to try something else. And so what if we had a third party piece of software that you could run on your phone and the drivers could run on their phone? That was the drivers cooperative software, that when you booked an Uber, it would grab the identifier that Uber associates with that transaction and then go to a lookup somewhere and say, like, is the person who made this transaction, the driver who made the transaction, or the passenger who made this transaction, are they running the driver's co-op app? If they are, we're going to automatically cancel the Uber, tear down the ride, and rebuild it as a driver's co-op ride. So, you wouldn't have to like become a kind of vegan of taxis, right? You could just stay with what you got, right? You could get that. You wouldn't have to like stand on a corner for an hour in the rain because you steadfastly refused to use the non-fair trade taxi service. But what you could do is make it so that anyone who was using the fair trade taxi service and anyone who wanted a fair trade taxi service could parasite off of Uber and bleed it dry one ride at a time by using it as dumb pipe, right? The barriers to that are not technical. The barriers to that are legal.
Well, one of my absolute favorite examples of parasiting on an app was the Deliveroo protests in London a few years ago, when one of the hardest problems that Deliveroo drivers had in advocating for better circumstances, better working conditions, was that they couldn't meet up. They didn't know who each other were. They couldn't form a union. They never met each other. And so what some of them did was a few of them managed to get together on an internet forum. They agreed to meet at a particular point at a particular time, and then they started ordering pizza to where they were. And they started bringing in drivers to where they were, and then basically radicalizing them on arrival. And that did lead to some further protests and some like negotiations and stuff like this. What does it look like once that parasitism has done its work? When Uber has collapsed, and this is getting into science fiction territory, and I'm not actually much of a futurist, and I don't like crazy predictions, but I do like to have some idea of what it would feel like to be in a situation where the Uber has collapsed, where it's only the co-op, where it is only like this network of local stores that fulfill all those needs because they're all that well networked. Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like?
So let's not. Yeah, I mean, let's not. So first of all, I also agree. Futurism's nonsense. The future is not predictable because what we do matters.
Means
optimism,
not ends.
pessimism.
Yes.
Yeah, they're fatalism. We can change the future. Future is ours to grab, not something that's going to come as a kind of deterministic outcome. This is the difference between being a novelist and an activist. Is you have to not get high on your own supply here and think that you could just plot the future the way you would a short story. The thing about all of those actors, right? Small merchants, individual delivery people, whatever, is that some of them are bastards, right? Like there's nothing like intrinsically great about being a small merchant, right? When I was a kid, there was the local corner shop that was just unbelievably horrible to the children who went in, even though we just went in and spent our money the way that grown-ups did. They did it because they could, right? And the difference isn't that this suddenly makes everyone who operates a service virtuous. It's that it makes them less important, right? It cabins off the harm they can do, because with a right of exit and a right to modify, then you can do what you can to tinker away at the service to reduce the harms that they do. And if that doesn't suit you, then you can go somewhere else at a low cost. And here again, like, the point is to make sure that our policies are administratable, right? That we don't want that while there are some things that are going to turn on some extremely subtle fact intensive questions like privacy questions, there are other ones that we can create very bright line tests, right? Like, so you mentioned the Fediverse and Mastodon. I think the most important feature of Mastodon and the Fediverse, more important than everything else about it, is the fact that you can save out the list of the people who follow you and the people that you follow, go to another service, upload it, and all of those followers and followees just move over in an eye blink, right? It's like 2 clicks. Everything else is less important once you've got that, right? Because, like, yeah, the moderator might be a jerk, the moderator might tolerate Nazis, the moderator might, you know, interfere with your messages and do bad things to you, and we can leave and go somewhere else, and we could administer a rule that says if someone wants to leave, you have to give them that data. And the reason we could administer that rule is because if I'm running a server and you leave and you say, hey, Cory didn't give me my data, all the regulator has to do is say, hey, Cory, James says he doesn't have his data. Can you give him another copy? I know you say you gave it to him. I know you say he's a liar. I don't give a shit. Just give him his data again. If you're going to insist that we add the word again to that sentence to satisfy your honor, fine. Give him his data again, which means that I can run a server for 10 people without needing a giant legal department and compliance department. It means that you don't have to be the size of Facebook, which means that I might have a weird idea and you might have a weird idea about how we conduct ourselves socially, what the physics of the interaction should be. And we can build that. You can build it and I can build it. And if we're wrong, the people who take a flutter aren't stuck forever.
Who has the power to do that? I noticed, for example, that in America, certain critics of tech in America, there's an idea that the EU seems to be have a head start on this kind of stuff. Like they do big stuff like GDPR, but they also do this kind of slightly odd, almost strange and beautiful things like the right to be forgotten. Like there's at least a belief in Europe that that tech can be regulated, even if it's not done terribly well. And I think the situation is quite different in Europe and the US. But like, what? Yeah, who's closest to doing this? Who could seize the means of making legislation?
So what's happened is that there are lawmakers and regulators everywhere. So the Digital Markets Unit of the Competition Markets Authority in the UK, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice in the United States, the European Commission, the Chinese cyberspace regulator is like really bullish on this stuff. All of these different regulators all over have the bit in their teeth, and they need political will, and they need they need protection, right? So the EU is doing the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which are, like everything the EU does, a mixed bag, right? They've got some good stuff and some bad stuff in there. You mentioned the right to be forgotten. It's a lovely sounding idea until you find out that the primary beneficiaries of it are war criminals who make newspapers take down articles about them, right? That's like less good, the cocaine runners who built the illegal hotel next to my flat in London used right to be forgotten. It took a long time to find out that they were cocaine runners who just gotten out of prison. That's the primary outcome of it. But it is a mixed bag. To enforce it, though, they're going to need a lot of political will, right? So you mentioned the GDPR. The GDPR failed because of European federalism, because the Irish political situation is such that they are completely dependent on big tech using them as a tax haven. And big tech basically said, if you fully fund your privacy commissioner, then we're going to take our business to Malta or wherever, Cyprus. And so they've got a data commissioner who hears 17 cases a year, while Germany's hears 500. And so since every case got brought against these tech companies in their headquarters in Dublin, and since the Irish, regulator basically gets out of bed at midday, never takes off their pajamas and eats cereal and watches cartoons all day, we never got GDPR enforcement. So, it is going to require this international effort of regulators. And the good news is that these companies are terrible in the same way everywhere they operate. So the Digital Markets Unit of the Competition and Markets Authority is 80 full-time engineers paid out by His Majesty's Treasury, but they never passed a secondary legislation to give them any enforcement powers. So all they do is research and write these 400-page incredible reports on the rot in the ad tech industry and the mobile industry and so on. But they can't enforce with them. On the other hand, the European Commission has got all the enforcement powers you want and no engineers. So they pick them up and run with them because everything rotten about these tech sectors in the UK is equally rotten in the EU. And so since they're so homogenized, since these tech platforms are so homogenized everywhere, anything that you do that works one place works everywhere. This is why Uber, anytime someone said, hey, it would be nice to have the tiniest iota, infinitesimal speck of regulation on Uber, Uber was like, Jesus Christ, no. Like we will destroy this city before we let it pass any regulation at all, because they knew that any regulation would be a template everywhere, because they were terrible in the same way everywhere.
That sounds like decentralization is
Yeah.
the secret power also in this
Yeah.
case, to that you can have a team working over here that it allows to like formulate a legislation that is then applied over here, that you can build out templates in this way. That
Yeah.
because that
You know, it's only a prisoner's dilemma if you can't talk to each other, right? And the thing is, these regulators can all talk to each other. Like, hilariously, capital is very bad at the prisoner's dilemmas we just saw with Silicon Valley Bank, where it was just like, if all these weirdos had just like not pulled their money out of the bank would have been fine, and they were allowed to talk to each other. They were playing like the easiest prisoner's dilemma, where they're all on Twitter together in a group chat, and they still failed. Like, that should give us incredible hope. A group of people who can't win the prisoner's dilemma when they're allowed to talk to each other as much as they'd like are actually going to be pretty easy to knock over.
I hope so.
I hope so too.